Hey, this is Françoise. Welcome to my channel and welcome to this new Halloween watercolor painting step-by-step tutorial. So if you like do-it-yourself illustrations and watercolor cards but you're still new to watercolor, here you will learn the basic techniques and you will even be able to experiment with just one color, and it can be whichever one you like. This is what I came up with using only my neutral tint watercolor and a bit of gouache. Let's just get straight into this new and easy Halloween DIY project. The first thing you want to do is to get your watercolor washes ready. This is always convenient and even more so whenever you need to use the wet on wet technique. I like to organize myself this way because I'm not wasting time thinking about mixing colors and the painting goes much faster. You can see that my watercolor paper is already cut out into a 5x7 format, and I taped it to a flat surface with some masking tape. I do this mostly because I like those clean and sharp edges, but if you don't, there's no need to take this step, even though it's not just pretty in the end, but also convenient throughout the painting process, since your sheets will remain steady. Like I said before, the only color I am using here, apart from white gouache, is a neutral tint watercolor by Winsor & Newton. And it's perfect here because it can get really opaque. At least that's my experience with this particular brand, but if you don't have that kind of color, a black or gray tone will do, or anything else, since we're keeping in monochrome anyways. To get a good range of shades for my single color, I dilute it with some water in various proportions. And this way I can work with a solid base right from the pan, an opaque wash, a diluted wash, and an even more diluted one. This is really important because it will help build up contrast and make the painting look more appealing. Now let's work on the background. Since we're using the wet on wet technique here, we really need to wet the paper generously enough just so that the color gets a chance to flow, but I don't overdo it to the point of getting puddles. For that type of work, I'm using a big natural hair fiber paintbrush from Raphael. However, if you're working with a smaller brush or a synthetic brush, it's just as fine. You may want to consider a big brush of backgrounds though. The bigger the brush, the faster it is to work on large areas. Equally as important, when you start dropping the lightest one of your washes, since we're going from light to dark here, make sure you're contributing to keeping the paper really wet but puddle-free still with that initial wash, meaning that this first wash needs to be watery enough. This way the paper keeps wetter even longer and the next colors or washes that you add afterwards will flow and fuse together much better, and you will have less chances of getting those annoying harsh lines from the paper drying way too fast. I make sure to leave part of the paper fairly white because these areas will be my highlights on the final painting. And highlights and on the opposite strong dark colors will make the watercolor painting look so much better, so it's really important to think about it right from the start. If you notice the watercolor spreading inside of your highlights, you can dab the paper with a paper towel to lift up some of that unwanted excess color. Now we're adding a darker wash and so on until we get through all of our shade options. Remember that the more saturated your color is, the less water there should be in your brush. And that's because if you keep adding lots of water onto the page, and by lots I mean as much as you added with your first wash, then not only will that take away from the contrast you're trying to build up, but worse than that, you will probably get blooms. Hold on here if this is a problem you've been having and it leaves you highly frustrated, because I made a video about that. Don't forget to watch it, the link should pop up here and I'll add it in the description as well. Once you understand how water works in watercolor, I promise your experiments will become more enjoyable and you will feel like you can move on and make progress. Now that I'm done adding my washes, I like to drop a bit of solid color here and there towards the end. If it looks like it's not fading into the previous washes, you can still soften those harsh edges out as long as your brush is only damp enough to do so. I decided to repeat this full background process about 3 times because I wanted to create depth for my background, and I dried the page in between each layer with a heat gun, even though a hairdryer set on low works perfectly fine. Layers are also a great way to perfect your painting where you need it, so I also took advantage of this to darken the edges around the moon to make it pop more, but in the end I ended up coloring that up with a halo I made with gouache. And it's totally up to you how you go about that. To finish my background, I also added some spots to the moon to make it more dimensional. I would recommend to do this when the whole page is still wet because in my case it wasn't, and the water I applied on the moon itself formed a nasty harsh line where it stopped. And that's something I noticed is that even plain water will leave marks sometimes. That usually happened to me when I was trying to do wet on wet on a small area that's part of a larger one that had already been painted, just like here. Anyways, to create some craters, I started dropping a barely diluted wash of my color here and there and faded the edges before they dry. This technique works fine as long as you proceed really fast. While the moon was still wet, I dropped a little bit of salt over the top to create fun highlights. The next step we're going to do is to paint the ground and the cats wet on dry. I think that's a really easy way to draw with watercolor. There's no rush like the wet on wet technique. What counts here is to make sure your wash is barely diluted with water, just so it looks opaque enough that you don't need to layer another wash on top. Also, you may want to consider using a small brush for details, which I did here for the cats. I used a synthetic brush since they're easier for details like these. At this point, I noticed that there was a harsh line for my moon, which I guess was fine, but since that wasn't what I was going for originally, I tried to fade it with a damp brush. Now we're ready to add the stars. I could have done this before painting the cats and ground, but I noticed that gouache will show through that opaque wash we used. To make the stars, I noticed it's easier when the gouache is diluted a bit, and I like to use a synthetic brush. The hair on these paint brushes are firmer than natural hair fibers, and I find it makes it easier to create those platters. Like I said before, I wasn't happy with the moon, so I worked on it a bit more by creating highlights on it and a halo around it as well with some gouache. I'll link here some more videos I made of watercolor painting for beginners that you're welcome to check out. If you like this Halloween watercolor painting step-by-step tutorial, let me know in the comments below, give this video a thumbs up and share with your friends, and also don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to be updated of my upcoming uploads. See you next time!